information came direct from Meghan's ex-husband, Trevor Engelson, via an intermediary. And obviously Trevor Engelson is a very successful TV producer. He now has his own family. He's very happy.
Some stories aren't protected because they're true. They're protected because they're fragile. They only work as long as no one touches the edges, no one asks the wrong questions, and no one looks too closely at how the narrative was built. For years, this was one of those stories clean, confident, and repeated often enough that it felt settled. But certainty doesn't disappear all at once. It cracks, quietly. What's different this time is how the doubt surfaced. Not through a press conference, not through a headline-grabbing interview, but through quiet confirmations passed privately off the record through people who had nothing to gain by speaking at all. That's what makes it harder to dismiss. This wasn't shouted, it was acknowledged. At the center of that acknowledgement is Trevor Engelson, a man who knew the story before it was refined, before it was simplified, before it was presented as something airtight. He was there before the edits, before the omissions, before the version everyone else learned to accept. And for years, he said nothing. Silence in cases like this isn't weakness, it's restraint. Because once doubt enters a story like this, it never fully leaves. Even if nothing else is said, the questions linger. The certainty softens, the confidence fades, and the narrative, no matter how polished, can't quite seal itself again. And the cracks don't start with royalty, they start long before the spotlight. Before the image was polished, before the talking points were rehearsed and repeated, Meghan Markle was unknown. No PR machine, no carefully managed narrative, no global audience waiting to interpret every gesture. She was just another young woman trying to find momentum in a crowded world, making choices that weren't meant to last forever, because at the time, no one imagined they would matter. This is where Trevor Engelson becomes important. Not as a commentator, not as a critic, but as a first-hand witness. He didn't learn her story through headlines or biographies. He lived alongside it before it was refined, before it was shortened, before certain details were quietly smoothed over to make everything fit better later on. That distinction matters. Witnesses see process. Outsiders only see results. As her public profile grew, the early years began to compress. Stories became cleaner. Timelines became simpler. Details that once existed as lived experiences turned into background noise or disappeared altogether. That's not unusual when fame arrives. Narratives get streamlined, edges get trimmed. But what's unusual is which details were simplified and which ones were emphasized later on. Because some narratives didn't just evolve, they appeared fully formed. Particularly around pregnancy, where the public was told what to believe rather than shown how to understand it. These weren't stories that emerged organically over time. They arrived already complete, already framed, already defended. And when you trace the timeline backward away from the finished product and toward the unpolished beginning, something stops making sense. The first time people noticed something felt off, it wasn't because of a headline or a rumor. It was because of appearances that didn't quite match expectations. Early public pregnancy moments involving Meghan Markle weren't met with outrage or disbelief. They were met with something quieter: confusion, subtle pauses, side glances, observations people kept to themselves. There were no bold claims at first, no declarations, just patterns that didn't behave the way people assumed they would, changes that seemed to happen too suddenly, shapes that appeared inconsistent from one appearance to the next, movements that observers found difficult to reconcile. None of this was presented as proof. It didn't need to be. It was simply noticed. What matters is where the questions came from. Not tabloids chasing clicks, not anonymous sources looking for attention, but ordinary viewers, medical professionals commenting anonymously online, and longtime royal watchers who had seen countless pregnancies before this one. They weren't comparing her to expectations, they were comparing moments to each other. And that's when quiet doubt begins. Because when something is authentic, it doesn't require explanation. It doesn't need defending. It just exists. Here, explanations arrived before questions did. Reassurances appeared before accusations, and that reversal caused people to stop nodding along automatically. No one rushed to conclusions. Most didn't say anything at all. But the tone shifted. Certainty gave way to curiosity. Acceptance softened into observation. And once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to reverse because people aren't reacting to words anymore. They're reacting to patterns. But visual doubts were only the surface. Documents made it deeper. What unsettled people even more than appearances was what didn't follow them. At that level of visibility, pregnancies are usually accompanied by a familiar rhythm, brief medical confirmations, carefully worded updates, and standard acknowledgments that reassure without oversharing. With Meghan Markle, that rhythm never quite arrived. Instead, official explanations remained broad, vague references to privacy, general statements about health, carefully chosen words that sounded complete while saying very little. There were no clear benchmarks, no moments that anchored the story medically. And while privacy is often cited in such cases, the absence felt different here. Not protective, controlled. What's notable is that there was no aggressive denial of questions either. No direct refutation, no firm correction, just silence. And silence in situations like this isn't neutral. It's strategic, because denial invites scrutiny. Silence lets questions hang without confirming or disproving them. Over time, that approach had an unintended effect. Instead of settling concerns, it amplified them. Each unanswered question became heavier than the last. Each non-response suggested that clarity wasn't coming, only repetition. And repetition without confirmation doesn't create trust. It creates distance. Medical certainty depends on consistency, on small, verifiable details that stack naturally. Here, that stacking never happened. The story moved forward, but it never solidified. People didn't feel reassured. They felt paused, as if something essential had been skipped. That's why even years later, the doubts never fully faded. Not because anyone proved something wrong, but because nothing was ever proven right either. The silence remained unresolved, waiting. And that silence would matter later when paperwork entered the picture. For many observers, the moment concerns shifted from theory to unease came not from photographs or silence, but from paperwork. Birth records are among the most controlled documents in any institutional system. They follow strict protocols, fixed formats, and rarely change once filed. That's why the handling of the birth documentation involving Meghan Markle drew quiet attention from those familiar with how these systems usually operate. What stood out wasn't the existence of a certificate, but what happened after it was filed. Changes were made, not corrections of spelling or clerical errors that happen every day, but structural adjustments that altered how information appeared. In institutional terms, that matters, because once a document is formally registered, post-filing modifications aren't routine. They require approval, justification, and discretion. This is where precedent becomes important. Records don't need to be destroyed to lose their original clarity. They only need to be adjusted cleanly, legally, and quietly. High-profile cases often have access to that kind of discretion. Not because rules disappear, but because flexibility exists where authority allows it. Framed properly, this isn't an accusation. It's a procedural irregularity. Systems are built on consistency, and when consistency bends, people notice, especially those who work inside those systems. A single alteration may mean nothing, but combined with earlier gaps, visual uncertainty, medical silence, it stops looking isolated. Once documentation shifts, assumptions shift with it. If one official record can change after the fact, it opens a door people assumed was closed, not to conspiracy, but to possibility. And possibility is enough to unsettle a narrative built on permanence. Once paperwork changes, older assumptions stop feeling permanent. By the time the questions reached elite circles, the tone had changed completely. This wasn't a theory being debated online or a claim splashed across tabloids. It was something far quieter. Surrogacy began circulating not as an accusation, but as an explanation spoken carefully, often prefaced with hesitation, and usually followed by silence. It's important to be clear about one thing. Surrogacy itself isn't scandalous. It's legal. It's common. And among high-profile families, it's far from rare. What draws attention isn't the method, it's the secrecy around it, especially when secrecy creates gaps that require increasingly complex explanations to maintain. Inside those circles, surrogacy wasn't framed as a revelation. It was framed as a solution, a way to reconcile physical inconsistencies without accusing anyone of deception, a way to explain medical silence without implying wrongdoing, a way to understand document adjustments without suggesting fabrication. When placed alongside everything else, it didn't create new questions, it answered old ones. This is also where context matters. Elite families don't operate under the same incentives as the public. Transparency isn't always the priority. Stability is. Continuity, image, preservation. Decisions are often made with long-term optics in mind, not immediate clarity. In that environment, discretion isn't avoidance, it's policy. And so the whispers stayed whispers. No press statements, no confirmations. Just quiet acknowledgement in spaces where certainty didn't need to be proven publicly to be accepted privately. The theory didn't spread because it was sensational. It spread because it fit. And this is where the story shifts, because someone from the past quietly confirmed the suspicion. What makes Trevor Engelson different from every other voice tied to this story is how little he's actually said. There was no interview, no memoir, no dramatic sit-down meant to reclaim attention. Whatever acknowledgement occurred didn't come directly from him to the public. It moved through intermediaries carefully, quietly, and without attribution. That distance wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. According to those familiar with the exchange, Trevor never framed anything as a revelation. He didn't present new claims or introduce fresh theories. Instead, he responded when asked, confirmed when pressed, and stopped short of elaboration. That restraint matters. People who want attention expand. People who want accuracy limit. His silence over the years is what gave weight to the later acknowledgement. He had opportunity after opportunity to speak during breakups, during media frenzies, during moments when public sympathy would have leaned his way. He chose not to. That kind of long-term silence builds credibility because it signals something simple: he wasn't trying to shape the narrative. He was trying to avoid it. And when his name surfaced again, it wasn't because he reopened the story. It was because the story reached him. The questions already existed. The inconsistencies were already circulating. All he did was stop denying what others had begun to piece together. That distinction is crucial. He didn't start the questions. He ended the denials. And in doing so, he shifted the story from speculation to possibility without ever stepping fully into the spotlight himself. But confirmation doesn't erase consequences. It creates new ones. Once the possibility of surrogacy entered the conversation, many expected a clear response, a confirmation, a denial, something definitive. But that moment never came, and for a reason. Acknowledging surrogacy wouldn't have addressed a single question. It would have unraveled several narratives at once. Visual certainty, medical timelines, documentation handling, and public messaging would all need to be re-explained. One admission would force a cascade of clarifications. This is where public trust becomes fragile. Trust isn't built on morality, it's built on consistency. Audiences can accept almost any personal choice when it's presented clearly. What they struggle with is retroactive explanation. When stories change after being defended, confidence doesn't adjust, it collapses. That's why partial explanations are often more dangerous than silence. Saying a little invites verification. Saying nothing delays it. Once a detail is acknowledged, every surrounding detail becomes fair ground for scrutiny. And in a story already burdened with gaps, even one confirmed shift could expose too much. So avoidance became containment, not panic, not confusion, strategy. Keep the narrative narrow. Don't introduce new variables. Let time soften curiosity. Let repetition replace clarity. This isn't unusual in high-profile environments. It's calculated risk management. The problem is that containment only works while trust holds. And trust doesn't disappear loudly. It erodes quietly. Each unanswered question weakens the structure just enough that the next one matters more. Over time, the silence that once protected the story becomes the very thing that destabilizes it. And once containment fails, the story stops being controllable. By the time a story reaches this point, proof is no longer the issue. Credibility is. Once enough inconsistencies accumulate, the question stops being what can be proven and becomes what can still be trusted. That shift is subtle but permanent, because proof requires evidence. Credibility requires belief, and belief once fractured doesn't simply return because nothing else is said. Unresolved questions don't fade with time, they linger. They resurface every time a detail changes, every time a document is amended, every time silence is chosen over clarity. Even when new information stops coming, the doubt remains active, quietly filling the gaps on its own. That's the danger of unanswered narratives. They don't stay neutral. They evolve. Public skepticism, once established, is almost impossible to reverse. Not because people are hostile, but because they become cautious. They stop accepting statements at face value. They listen differently. They notice patterns they once ignored. And from that moment on, every future explanation carries a weight it didn't have before. This is why the story isn't about exposure. Nothing was dramatically revealed. No single moment blew everything open. What happened instead was a slow collapse. A narrative built on control, consistency, and repetition began to lose its internal logic. Piece by piece, it stopped holding together. When stories collapse this way, they don't shatter, they sink. Quietly. Permanently. The public doesn't demand answers anymore. They stop expecting them. And that may be the most damaging outcome of all. Which leads to the question no one can fully answer. When you step back and look at everything together, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. Visual moments that raised quiet questions. Medical silence that never fully reassured. Documents that shifted instead of settling, and confirmations that arrived indirectly, carefully, without spectacle. None of these elements mattered much on their own. What gave them weight was how neatly they intersected. At every critical point, certainty was postponed rather than established. Questions weren't answered, they were delayed. Doubt wasn't confronted, it was managed. And for a while that worked. Controlled narratives can survive for years when repetition replaces clarity and confidence substitutes for confirmation. But control only functions as long as no one pulls the threads together. That's the real takeaway here. This isn't a story about scandal or shock. It's a lesson in how narratives fail when they rely too heavily on silence. When too many details are smoothed over, the surface may look flawless, but the foundation weakens. And once credibility starts to erode, no amount of polish can fully restore it. Nothing definitive was ever proven wrong, but nothing was conclusively proven right either. The result is a permanent gray space, one where explanations exist, but certainty doesn't. And in that space, debate thrives. Not because people want drama, but because they want coherence. So the story doesn't end with answers. It ends with tension, with unresolved questions that refuse to disappear. If nothing was hidden, why was so much never clearly explained?